It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome here this evening Chris Huhne. Many of you will know him already. He was an award-winning journalist first, and then a very successful MEP. Since he arrived in the Commons in 2005, he's held a number of briefs. First the Treasury brief, then the Environment, and since 2007, he's been Shadow Home Secretary. Nor do any of you really need me to tell you this is a hugely important issue if you look at the polls of the most important issues facing the country. And it's something the Policy Exchange has become more interested in. It's not one of our main areas, but we've published recently on demographics in our paper about the power of numbers. We held an event which some of you may have been at here a couple of weeks ago. So an important speech on a very important issue. And without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Chris Huhne. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to do a speech for Policy Exchange. I've been a great admirer of some of the work that you've done, and I'm a great believer in think tanks and in trying to bridge the gap between hard, peer-reviewed academic evidence and useful policy research, so I'm delighted to be here. And what I wanted to talk about was immigration and what has gone wrong. And let me start with some facts that show, in my view, that something has gone seriously wrong with our immigration policy. And in the latest Ipsos Mori Issues Facing Britain poll, immigration is second only to our ailing economy and what people think are the most important issues facing Britain today. More important than crime, more important than jobs, more important even than the NHS. A third of people say so. And this is an extraordinary verdict on Labour's immigration policy, because 10 times as many people today believe immigration to be the most important issue facing Britain as believed that when Labour came to power. In 1997, only 3% of people thought that immigration was key. Nor is this an effect of the recession. In fact, there has been a slight fall in concern since 2 years ago, although remaining at very high levels. So for anyone like me, committed to an open, tolerant and liberal society, this is damning testimony of Labour's failure to inspire public confidence in managing immigration. And in one way, the news is even worse than that, because it is not just Labour that takes the blame. An ICM poll revealed that 2/3 of the British public believe that none of the mainstream parties have credible policies on immigration. And what is certainly true is that politicians from all sides have been too unwilling to listen to concerns about immigration and to talk about it. Too scared to talk about the elephant in the room for fear of being labelled a racist or losing votes. But leaders who fail to address the most important concerns of their people run the risk of losing their own credibility. And it's that loss of trust and credibility that creates space for extremists and bigots. So we have to deal with the arguments head on, and we particularly have to admit to failures. Both Labour and the Tories have failed on immigration. They have both been responsible for what can only be described as catastrophic mismanagement. We in the Liberal Democrats have to take our share of the blame too. We haven't failed on policy, as I will explain later, and we clearly haven't been in government for a long time. But we have failed to make the case for a liberal immigration policy as long as it is well managed. And I define well managed to mean that the consequences can be predicted and justified. So the public's trust is at stake. The country's historic liberalism on this issue, on immigration, is at stake. So let me start with a case that would, until recently, have been widely accepted as self-evident. We have always had a tolerant attitude towards migration. It's not just something of the 50s and 60s. We are a nation of seafarers, and the sea is, of course, the motorway of history. We have built our culture on trade, on openness, on tolerance. We are fundamentally a commercial people who buy cheap and sell dear, and we do not seek to offend, because if we do, we may put off our customers and curtail our profits. We are rightly proud of Britain being an open, welcoming country. The legacy of our historic openness is our language, which is the greatest artifact of our civilization. It contains 3 times as many words as French or Russian, twice as many words as Spanish, and the sheer richness of English vocabulary tells us of all the global influences that have been imprinted on a nation where the most remote village is just 70 miles from the sea. If you want to be pure and distant genetically, head for the Swiss Alpine valleys. We don't do remote on these islands. We do Jutes, Celts, Picts, Angles, Vikings, Saxons, Romans, Normans, Huguenots, Germans, Jews, Afro-Caribbeans, Kashmiris, Punjabis, Cantonese, Gujaratis, Poles, Lithuanians, and that's just about half of it. The British truly are people of the world. And immigration has been of enormous benefit to us, economically and culturally. Our schools, our hospitals, our businesses are better, thanks to thousands of people who've come here from overseas. Immigrants are not any old people. They are people who take risks to up sticks and move country, who have a belief in themselves and an ambition for their families, and a dedication to their country of destination. Immigrants have made an enormous, and continue to make, an enormous contribution to British life. From the heart surgeon Sir Magdi Yaqub, to the Filipino nurse on the local hospital night ward, from England's best batsman, Kevin Peterson, to your neighbour's Estonian cleaner, Joseph Conrad wrote English so perfect that he could only have been a Pole whose second language was English. Sir Tom Stoppard is one of our finest dramatists and was born a Czech. Britain would grind to a halt without the hard work, the talent and the creativity of people who have washed up on our shores in the hope of a better life. So we need to make the case for immigration because it is an essential part of what it means to be a self-confident Briton. But it has to be a case for an immigration system that delivers some semblance of the objectives that have been set out. There has to be some connection between the rhetoric and the reality. And that is why public concern has mounted. We've had 2 decades of appalling mismanagement and staggering incompetence from both Labour and the Tories. In the last 10 years, the average annual net immigration from outside Europe is 173,000. That compares with 52,000 a year in the previous decade. In addition, we took the brave decision, brave in the sense of a ministerial advisor advising the minister, to open up our labour market to Central and Eastern European member states before any other EU country except for Sweden and Ireland. Germany, France and Italy continue to impose transitional border controls on Polish, Czech and other immigration. Whitehall predicted that 52,000 new entrants would come from the new member states. The actual number was 766,000. That is an overshoot of 1,373%, which makes this quite possibly one of the worst government forecasts in history. I'm a bit of a connoisseur of those, having followed economics over a long period of time. Because there's been such a large unplanned influx of foreign workers, we have failed to plan for the social consequences. In many areas there has been undue strain on our public services and on housing. In London's Haringey, for example, the numbers registering for an NHS doctor are 7% higher than the population predicted by the census on which public spending allocations are based. In some districts, pay rates have been adversely affected. That was the case in Southampton, near me in Eastleigh, where building trade saw skilled rates slashed. In other areas, there's been resentment at the allocation of social housing. And these unintended consequences have bred resentments which in turn make it harder for people to integrate. If you want, as I do, to sustain a consensus for a liberal immigration policy. The public has to have confidence that we are properly managing the flow to ensure that the pace of change is acceptable and reasonable, and that areas of destination have the resources to provide sound public services. Let me now turn to another area of mismanagement. We simply do not have adequate border security. Quite apart from EU migration and legal migration from outside the EU, illegal migration is far too high. We just don't know how many people are living illegally in Britain. It's impossible. It's one of those figures like the size of the black economy. But it is unlikely to be less than 500,000. We count people in, but we don't even bother to count people out. We don't know who is here and who is not. We issue 2 million temporary visas every year, and we don't check if people leave when they're supposed to do so at the end of those temporary visas. Illegal overstayers on student visas are the biggest loophole in the system and fairly now well publicised, but it cannot be closed without exit checks. And remember that those exit checks were abolished in a fit of absent-mindedness by the Conservatives in 1994 because they thought they weren't value for money. It left our immigration system in tatters. Labour got rid of the remaining checks in 1998. Result? Welcome visa overstayers. We've not been able to limit immigration to legal migration for more than a decade, and it's time to reverse the Tories' big mistake. At long last, Labour are beginning to do so with the e-borders scheme. But even now, only 2/3 of the people leaving the country can be checked. The Liberal Democrats would reintroduce exit checks immediately. The e-borders scheme will, in theory, be up to checking at over 90% of exits by the end of this year. But these things are not always introduced on time, and they certainly have not been introduced on time in terms of the target at the end of last year. Now, in theory, we could compensate for the difficulties of policing our frontier by tougher action within Britain. When 192 million people come in and out of our airports every year, immigration control at the border is no easy matter. But the government has been little better at internal control. Employers who hire illegal immigrants are guilty of simple exploitation. They should be investigated, prosecuted, and convicted. Yet the government has brought just 114 employers to the courts on criminal charges of immigration breaches since 1997. Yes, there are now more flexible civil penalties, but a real deterrent is criminal prosecution, not a small slap on the wrist. We need a national border force with police powers to enforce frontier control. That has, of course, been taken up now, not the police powers aspect, but the national border force by the government, having previously been taken up by the Conservatives. I would merely like to point out that it was Liberal Democrat policy first, and I think quite right. And there should be tough enforcement of visas within the country by checking employers. Let me now turn to the issue of legal migration and how much there should be. The misjudgment of the impact of EU enlargement is now past history. Some of the immigrants are going home. We've not made the same mistake again with either Romania or Bulgaria. We will open our borders there at the same time broadly as Germany, France and the rest. So there should be no sudden surges from the existence of free movement within the EU. And we benefit enormously from that freedom. You do not have to be an aficionado of Auf Wiedersehen pet to realise how many British people take advantage of the opportunity to work and live in other member states. Indeed, more British people live in other EU countries than EU immigrants live here. So the simple UKIP line, close down the borders against the rest of the EU, would actually lead to an increase of population, assuming that other EU countries adopted the same line. The real issue is then migration from outside the European Union. The government has effectively closed down many of the old routes of primary immigration immigration to two. Either people have skills which our economy needs, and I will turn to this in a minute, or they want to come here to study and should then leave again. And I believe it is a great benefit to us that people want to come here to study. We make friends for life, and usually friends in high places when they return to their own countries. President Bill Clinton was an Oxford Rhodes Scholar, and he was one of many. This is also extraordinarily important in maintaining the global reputation of our higher education and research institutions, so it concerns me that the government should be quite so heavy-handed and insensitive about student visas. Surely we should be capable of distinguishing between people who come here as students who have an enormous incentive to stay, perhaps because their countries are so poor, and a Japanese person, say, who wants to come to learn English and is very unlikely to fail to return. Yet ministers are now insisting that we cannot offer basic language courses. It would be better to be more liberal, in my view, about visas and more thorough about enforcing returns through exit checks. Well, what about skilled immigration? Should we, as the Conservatives want, set a further national cap on non-EU immigration so that we tighten the numbers who are entering this country to work in a shortage occupation? I am sceptical. It seems to me, frankly, that the Conservative Party's policy is risible in this area. It has been written by a focus group rather than based on policy reality. In a bid to look tough, the Conservatives have undergone an unlikely conversion to socialist planning. Their proposed annual cap on immigration is about as flexible and workable as Soviet Gosplan's quota for the production of left shoes. Market economies vary in unplanned and flexible ways. I'm surprised to have to make that lesson to the Conservative Party, but if you just pull up the drawbridge at some point in the year because you've reached some arbitrary limit, what damage, potentially, will you do to business? When I was in the city, I had to hire an Arabic-speaking economist with a political knowledge of the Middle East. If I'd been unable to do so, and there were none in the UK, we would have employed fewer British people as salesmen, cleaners, and IT support. And the only people who can now come here from outside the EU are those with skills that we need. What if we need Japanese sushi chefs, or American aviation chefs, or Russian-speaking economists? If they're not able to be hired, there are likely to be fewer jobs for British workers, not more. Would the Conservatives really stop Arsenal from signing Andre Arshavin in the transfer window, or Chelsea from signing Didier Drogba just because they'd reached some preordained limit? It's a gimmick. It's not serious policy. The other Conservative mistake is shared by Labour, and it is to treat Britain as a single entity with exactly the same population and skills needs in every area. Labour's points-based system was a step in the right direction after years of negligence on immigration, but it is still a one-size-fits-all approach which ignores the different economic needs of the regions and nations of this country. The big southeast of England, London and its Veneto, is now the most densely populated part of Europe. It's more crowded than the Netherlands. In the southeast, we're reaching the population limits of environmental sustainability. There is less water per head in the southeast of England than in Syria or the Sudan. It's so bad that Thames Water want to build a Saudi-style desalination plant, creating fresh water by processing salt water until the salt is left behind. Frankly, in an era of climate change where we're worried about energy use, this is madness. By contrast, some areas are crying out for population growth to help the economy grow. Take Scotland, for example. All the mainstream parties in Scotland are agreed on the need for immigration, even the Tories. The Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament, Gavin Brown, has called for, and I quote, positive net migration to fill our shortages at all skill levels, unquote. But one question David Cameron and his team cannot answer is how a national limit can be appropriate for both the South East and Scotland. In reality, it would merely bring in the worst of all worlds. Most immigrants would continue to head for the most populous and attractive parts of the country, so the policy would be too lax for the southeast of England and too tight for Scotland. It's left to the Liberal Democrats to provide a hard-headed assessment of the needs of different regions and parts of the economy, as well as the needs of different industries. We would add a regional element to the points-based system. It should be easier for migrants to get a work permit in areas that want more people. Correspondingly, it should be harder to get a work permit in areas where the population is becoming unsustainable. As happens in Australia and Canada, the system will take account of where immigrants are most needed. Every region, and indeed travel to work area, within a region has different skills shortages. One area might not need any social workers, another might. There might be a shortage of dentists in one place, but not generally. We need a system that reflects those different needs and provides work permits that entitle people only to work in shortage areas. The one thing we should not and cannot do is force anyone to live in a particular place. If someone wants to live in Southampton and work in Scotland, they could, but I would submit that that is highly unlikely, and many people are certainly not going to opt for that possibility. For anyone who's experienced the price of rail travel under Labour, it, apart from everything else, seems a pretty tall order. But what we can do is specify where people work. As is the case now, migrants would require sponsorship from an employer. The only change that needs to be made is that visas under our system would detail in which region or nation of the UK a migrant can work. Now, people always tell me that this may well work in Australia or Canada, but it's not going to work in a small island like ours. The size of the country does not matter. Australia has managed to make the system work for rural areas and suburbs of cities in New South Wales, where people who've come in under the system have put down roots with their families. But the most important thing is how rigorously the system is enforced. Policing our immigration system doesn't stop at our borders. Checks must be made on employers to see if they're actually employing who they say they are. If a firm in London is employing someone who can only legally work elsewhere, they would be breaking the law in exactly the same way as if they had no visa at all. They're no better than the unscrupulous companies who knowingly hire illegal immigrants with no work permit. Just as unforgivably, Labour have failed to help new migrants to integrate. Areas like Newham and Haringey have far greater needs than their allocations suggest, as we've seen. Local finance for public services must be based on real populations and real needs. And even worse, English language teaching of those whose English is only a second language has been cut back. And this is an extraordinarily short-sighted policy. Now, faced with this complexity, the main response of Labour and the Tories is tough rhetoric. Take deportations. Labour and the Tories both blithely promised to deport all the illegal immigrants in Britain. But the truth is that there may be 750,000. I said 500,000, nobody really knows. With deportations costing an average of £11,000, we're looking at a bill, if it's 750,000, of £8 billion. I bet that hasn't been factored into the vague plans to tackle public debt in either the Labour Party or the Conservatives. The Liberal Democrats are the only party which is prepared to be realistic about deportations. We would focus deportation efforts on criminals, the drug dealers and people traffickers are not welcome in this country, and on recent visa overstayers. And we would give families who have been here for 10 years, have no criminal record, speak English, and who just want to work and pay taxes, the right to earn British citizenship. This will happen after a 2-year probationary period and undertaking community service. And this conditional earned route to citizenship is not easy. It's not an amnesty. It's not as simple as the proposal made by Boris Johnson and other elements in the Conservative Party. But it is a response to a problem that should not be swept under the carpet. Let me, before I conclude, just for the sake of completing the picture, say a few words about refugees, what certain sections of the press now refer to as asylum seekers. The distinction with ordinary immigration is crucial. People still arrive here in fear of their lives. I've had constituents myself, for example, who've come from Zimbabwe, having been involved in the opposition movement there. We must continue to respect our international obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention, and we must do so in a way that removes this essential act of humanitarianism from the vice-like grip of populist criticism. Thanks to the hue and cry about bogus asylum seekers, the process of vetting has become so tough, and I would say so politically driven, that appeals against those decisions are now very high and very successful. Some 70% of asylum claims are now rejected, but 23% of those are then accepted on appeal. And it would simply be better, quicker, fairer and cheaper to introduce a Canadian-style independent agency to make those assessments. Just 1% of appeals are overturned, of judgments are overturned on appeal under this system. And while asylum seekers wait for their case to be heard, they should be allowed to work rather than live on the edge of destitution. And if they fail in their claim, the process of removal should at least be humane. Incarcerating women with their children in a detention centre like Yarlswood is simply unacceptable, and we should adopt the Swedish model of best practice. I don't believe there would be any change, frankly, in security there. As anybody who's trying to make a quick getaway with a toddler in tow will know that that's extremely unlikely. If we are to establish, re-establish, a national consensus around a liberal immigration policy, as we should, we must restore public trust and faith in the system. And in this talk, I've spelled out what I believe to be the essentials of such an approach. A national border force with police powers, the reintroduction of exit checks, more focused deportation, tougher action against employers are all part of controlling our frontier. The points-based system should be reformed to make the regional dimension crucial, and free movement within the European Union for us is a given. Sadly, however, it is far easier to lose trust than to regain it. But the sooner we start, the sooner we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Lots to think about there. Chris has very kindly agreed to take a couple of questions. We've got a little bit of time before we finish, so over to you. I'll let you pick the people from the audience.
Go on, Sam.
Hello. Good evening. Thank you for that talk. It will alarm you to know that I agree very largely with your analysis. I hope that doesn't give you too much concern. It's when you come to your policy that, of course, I disagree.
Norman Tebbit also agrees with our tax policy. I don't know if you do.
Oh, does he? I don't understand the parallel at all.
I'm very happy to take friends from wherever.
How kind, how kind. But it's when you come to your policy that really you're struggling. Because it's easy for you to attack the Conservatives and Labour. They've made a shambles of it. And I'm glad to hear you attack them and to point out the serious weaknesses. Policy. I'll only raise 2 points. One is, the simple one, is your proposal for illegal immigrants. Let's not call it an amnesty. Let's just recognise that there have in fact been 5 amnesties in Italy, 6 in Spain in the last 25 years. Every time, far more applicants. It's perfectly clear, indeed I would have thought self-evident, that proposals that have the effect of an amnesty increase the future number who will overstay or whatever. I'd have thought that was obvious. But the more serious point is the question. You talked about confidence, and I think that's absolutely right. I think it's completely lacking in the public. I would suggest that the only way you can restore confidence is to have people understand, A, what they feel, B, that you know that the continuation of the existing policy will lead to 70 million in 20 years, and C, and this is the crux of it, that you have an idea, not a target, but a broad strategic aim for immigration policy, such as the cross-party group on balanced migration are proposing, which is close to zero, but you can have 40,000 if you like. But if you just talk about historical, liberal immigration policies, it's lovely to hear, and you do it very beautifully, but for the ordinary person in the street, it's balls unless you actually have a clear objective.
Well, I think, let me take those two in turn. First of all, the issue is what we're proposing as an earned route to regularisation and amnesty. I read out a very clear list of pretty restrictive conditions. And remember that what we're proposing would be going hand in hand with a very much tougher regime of control at the frontier and of internal control in terms of policing of visas. So I just don't accept the read across from the sort of blanket amnesties that you've had in Southern Europe in terms of encouraging further immigration. I think that what we're trying to get is a balance which ensures that you get real control over legal migration and that you stop illegal migration, and at the same time that you deal with that legacy issue which has been there. In many cases, people who've been here for years and years, whose children are going through our schools, whose children actually know no other country, and yet they don't have a legal right to be here. And I just think from a humanitarian point of view, I don't think we have it in us as a people to chuck those sort of people out, and we don't. And so let's please be realistic about the problem and be realistic about the solution. Look, on the confidence issue, you can reduce this to a numbers game if you want, the famous 70 million. But I would say two things about 70 million. I've been around long enough and have enough grey hair, and I've looked at enough ONS projections on demography to know that they do tend to change. And that's also the case, by the way, for other countries. And what we've seen over the last 10 years in terms of the impact of non-EU immigration running at over 170,000 a year is a very dramatic period of net inwards migration. In addition, you've had the Central and Eastern European immigration, again, completely unplanned. If you take that as your base case and project its continuation, which is, with some differences, very largely what the ONS does. I mean, it is pretty mechanical, actually. I know you're disagreeing, but these projections usually are pretty mechanical. Then you will get a very large number. So the first point is, I bet you that that changes. The second point that I would say is that, frankly, 70 million in itself doesn't tell us much about the quality of life in this country. If all of the increase was in, say, Scotland, which is the least densely populated part of Europe, it would be a very different story in terms of the quality of life to the situation where all of the increase was in London and the southeast, which is the most densely populated part of Europe. So again, we come back to a number which is basically an overall national target. I don't think it really tells you much about the quality of life, which is ultimately what we're attempting to protect here. So for both of those reasons, I don't think we should scare people. Now, just one final point if I may, because you mentioned the all-party parliamentary group on balanced migration. One of their proposals is to try and separate out more than is the case at the moment, the work permit from the citizenship route. And I have to say, I hope people don't go down that road, because apart from anything else, we know what happened in Switzerland and in Germany when people went down the so-called Gastarbeiter route under the theory that you could let people in for a short time and then they would all go home again. I mean, again, we don't as a civilized society have it in us to do what the Gulf states do, which is, you know, get in families as domestic servants and so forth from India and Pakistan, have them there for 5 years and shut them out. And I think that's an appalling policy. So I think we have to be very, very careful on that front as well. I think it's not a free lunch, which is what I think Nick Soames and Frank Field seem to be suggesting on that front. Yes?
Very logical and rational policies.
Thank you.
I'm sure Norman would approve.
Thank you.
But As a former finance minister, can you say a bit about the costs of implementation come the 7th of May, and you are deciding whether to support one or other party in government?
Well, specifically on immigration or generally?
On immigration.
Well,
there are costs.
There are costs, clearly, and one of the things which we are saying is that we should have at least an immediate reintroduction of exit checks, if necessary, manually in the key ports and airports, and that will have a cost. We are making very substantial savings on other elements of the Home Office budget, and I'll mention two. One is the ID card scheme, and the other is the upgrading of biometric passports, which are currently at the same technological level as the US, and that is what we need in order to continue to have the visa waiver scheme with the US. But the government is planning to raise that so that it will be able to take on board not just a photo and a facial identification, but also fingerprints, which would bring us in line with the Schengen area. Now, we don't need to do that, and it is horribly expensive. So if you take the savings as a whole, you will have, I promise you, the Liberal Democrats have done, in every general election since 1992, and I've been involved in many of these exercises, we've produced a fully costed manifesto, and we will show where we intend to make the expenditure savings and where we intend to put the extra expenditure, and that will make the numbers clear. But within the Home Office budget, despite the fact that we are committed to rather fewer extra police officers than we had previously been arguing because of the change in the financial and economic circumstances, we are still looking to make overall savings because of cutting out some of these, in our view, unnecessary schemes that the government's embarked on. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I must say I found your conclusions rather vague because you didn't touch upon some of the other complicating factors. There are now 60 different ways of migrating to this country. You conflated, although you claim not to, you conflated asylum and migration and illegal migration. You didn't say anything about what to do about failed asylum seekers. You seem to be saying, well, we should allow them to stay just because they failed. And that doesn't seem to make sense. If they have failed, if their claims are manifestly unfounded, then they should be returned.
Well,
same with illegal migrants. You haven't said anything about deporting them. You haven't said anything about the cost of deporting them versus the cost of not deporting them. You seem not to have looked upon the fact that the issues may be national, but the costs fall disproportionately on local communities, which have been tested beyond endurance by changes which have been too rapid. That's one of the conclusions of the Campbell report on community cohesion. So a lot of the stuff has been actually vague. What are you going to do about the fact that in a place like Haringey, which has been bedeviled by transients, which was denied on the grounds that to refer to transients is racist, now every single report in Haringey refers to transients, apparently is anti-racist. So, I don't quite see where you would be, where you would actually be dealing with migration in terms of numbers. I would actually say that this country is overpopulated. The migration has taken place without popular consent. It's been imposed on the people of this country who've been paying for it. Disproportionately, the poorest people have been paying the most. Now, I don't actually see, I can see the liberal instincts and liberal rhetoric behind your sentiments, but basically, what will be the net result of all this? Are you going to, would a liberal government, a liberal Democrat government, or a government supported by the Democrats, which may be more realistic, would you be in favor of deporting illegal immigrants, or would you be in favor of granting them what is actually an amnesty? Just say yes or no.
Let me merely refer you. I agree that it is always an enormous risk when you deliver a long speech to assume that every member of the audience will be paying attention at every moment. But I actually, on at least two of the points that you raise, I have very clear answers in this, and if you look at the speech on the website, you will see that those answers are there. I say very clearly that we continue deportation, and that the focus on deportation should first of all be particularly in criminals, but secondly, on short-term visa overstayers. So yes, we continue deportations. I also say, in dealing with the asylum seekers, and I quote again, and if they fail in their claim, the process of removal should at least be humane. The process of removal must continue. So I'm sorry that you didn't hear those aspects of what I said, but they're very clear. I'll come back to this. You want me to say that there should be a population target for this country. Now, I frankly think that there are so many, speaking as somebody who's reasonably statistically adept as a former economist, there are so many variables in what makes up our population that I think it would be extraordinarily rash of any government to set population as an overall target. Certainly, even China, with a one-child per family policy, which is a pretty brutal instrument, and I imagine that you would not be advocating that anytime soon in the United Kingdom. Even China finds it quite hard to predict what its population is going to be with a policy instrument as direct and as brutal as that. So I simply think that that is not a sensible way forward. And I come back to also making the point that if, say, the population were to increase to 70 million, and I don't accept that's very likely because of the reasons that I gave, but if it were to increase to 70 million, the quality of life for the people who live here would crucially depend on where the extra population was. And if that extra population is in London and the South East, the quality of the impact on the quality of life would be far worse than if the population is in areas of the country where the density of population is very low. And so my fundamental point here is that actually the question, what is your overall population limit going to be, is actually not a very sensible one if we're trying to maximize the welfare of the people who live in this country. We have to make regional and indeed national distinctions, and that's one of the reasons why we put forward this proposal for a regional-based scheme. I think maybe just one more, and then probably, or if there are no others, I'm very happy to head for the drinks. Anybody else like?
Much like the chairman's probably have the last
Sure.
question. There's lots of different interesting ideas in the speech. The regional one is the nearest one to me. How does this work exactly? So let's just say I come to the UK and I work for a big IT firm or something, and I've got work permits working in Glasgow. Can that firm then send me off to do work in London and my previously working on a different location? What's the administrative burden do you think of trying to have this kind of regional system?
I mean, the system is exactly as it currently works in Australia and Canada. So the points-based system that we thought we'd adopted in this country, the Conservatives began talking about, Labour then adopted, was actually a pale imitation of what operates in Australia and Canada, because they do have this regional, indeed, right the way even down to travel to work areas. If, for example, you'd avail yourself of the exemption for multinationals usually have to move employees, it's unlikely you'll be tied down to a particular area. But if you were tied down to a particular area, then that is where you have to stay in terms of your work. Very simple. And it is enforced in exactly the same way as we enforce any other visa, which is we check with employers. And employers are liable if they are employing somebody who has a visa which is not applicable to their particular area, in just the same way as they would be liable if they were employing someone who had no visa at all.
I think, on that note, just remains for me to say, and thank you for coming. Very, very thought-provoking speech, I'm sure you all agree. And great to see you for all this exchange. Chris Huhne.